afraid of the dark?
Let me tell you a story about my father's friend. I'll warn horror enthusiasts right away, this story isn't for you. It lacks scary moments, demons, monsters, and witchcraft, but it's not devoid of mystique. This story is about a life where we humans are sometimes scarier than any monsters. It all started in the early 80s when my father went to work in the taiga. There, he befriended a local resident, let's call him Frank. They became close, best friends even. For the 2 years my dad worked there, they were inseparable. When it was time to leave, they didn't see each other for 25 years until fate brought them together again. Randomly, at one of the city markets. As customary, they went to celebrate the reunion in a cafe with a bottle of cognac. When they sat down, my father noticed that Frank was missing 2 fingers on his right hand, the index and middle fingers. "What happened?" my father inquired. "I'll tell you, but you won't believe it," Frank replied. "You know me, I trust you more than anyone else, and we've never lied to each other," my father insisted. "Okay, I'll tell you, but I've never told anyone this before today so they wouldn't laugh at me or think I'm crazy," said Frank, and he began his story. Here it is in his words. 2 years after you left, a businessman moved to our village, revived the collective farm, bought tractors, cattle, both small and large, and life became moderate. Many went to work for him, a small but steady income. We were all content, despite this rich man acting like a god and the master of everything and everyone. He was terribly harmful, but we tolerated it because there was nowhere else to go. One day he got furious when his cattle started disappearing, blaming wolves for the losses. And indeed, it was probably them, as often the remains of the cattle were found gnawed in the forest. He offered a reward for every wolf killed, sparking a frenzy of wolf extermination in our taiga. Of course, I didn't stay out of it. Extra earnings never hurt. It got to the point where we split into 2 teams with the men and started competing to see who could bring more wolf heads by evening. We bet 3 bottles of vodka for the evening feast. The first day, our team lost, so we agreed with the guys to get up earlier and go deeper into the forest to find more prey. We got up at dawn, gathered, and set off. The day started well. We managed to shoot 3 in the morning, but then there was silence, and for several hours, not a single wolf. We decided to rest and have a snack. Not far away, under a big rock, there was a cave, and from there a wolf came out and growled at us, which seemed very strange because they usually run away at the sight of people. Without much thought, I shot him accurately in the head, saying, "The 4th is ready." We ate, left the carcass lying there. We collected them on the way back, making platforms out of branches. Then we caught 2 more and decided to go home, collecting our bloody harvest on the way. When we reached our campsite, I froze. 3 wolf cubs were stuck to the dead mother's chest, drinking milk. Tears flowed like a river on their own until I was struck by another shotgun blast. In the words of one of the guys, 1 shot killed 3. Even the little ones had their heads. I rushed to the cubs, picked up one still alive in my arms, and imagine a little bundle of fur, bleeding, dying in my arms. With its eyes, it looked into mine, then licked my hand, closed its eyes, shed 2 tears, and its little heart stopped beating. I'm telling you, I'm crying myself now. I began to shout, "It's a child. You've killed a child. You've killed innocent children. They're just kids. They're not guilty of anything. What difference does it make whether it's a human or a wolf? Children are all the same." After that, I lunged and started hitting anyone in sight. Whoever came my way. I lost my mind until they grabbed me and I calmed down a bit. And guess what? They and their bunch were about to be thrown into a pile. I broke free again, shouting, "Don't touch them, or I'll shoot you." All the guys left me with the words, "Well, stay with them. We're leaving." I dug a grave, buried them together, the mother and her children. I sat by the grave for a long time, begging for their forgiveness. Like a madman, it began to darken, and I headed home. Gradually, I began to forget about this incident, but I never went wolf hunting again. Years passed. Winter, no work. But the family needed to be fed. I went hunting for a hare, maybe a deer if I was lucky. I wandered all day, but there wasn't a single animal around. Just as I was about to head home, a snowstorm broke out. So strong that nothing could be seen beyond my nose. The icy wind pierced to the bone, and I felt myself freezing, realizing that if I didn't make it home soon, I would die of hypothermia. There was nothing left but to go home blindly. So, I wandered in an unknown direction for several hours until I realized that I was hopelessly lost. My strength left me, and I collapsed in the snow. Unable to feel my arms or legs, I couldn't move. Only occasionally lifted my eyelids to take one last look at the world before death. The storm subsided, the full moon rose, but I had no strength left. All I could do was lie there and await death. When I opened my eyes again, the she-wolf was standing before me with her cubs. They just stood and watched me. I remember the thought that flashed through my mind. I deserve this. You can take me. Some time later, they turned around and climbed the hill. But, oddly enough, in complete silence, I didn't hear their footsteps, nor were there any traces left behind. Time seemed to slow down. I felt every second of life when suddenly the coffin-like silence was broken by the howling of wolves. Not just one, but a whole pack. I looked at the hill where my ghostly guests had disappeared, and from there descended a whole horde of wolves. Well, that's it, I thought. Here comes death. Being eaten alive, there was no thought of reaching for the gun, as my hands hadn't listened to me for a long time. All I could do was watch as death drew nearer and nearer. Now one was already at my feet, followed by 10 more wolves. I muttered, "Well, what are you waiting for? Eat while I'm still warm," but they stood and watched. The one standing at my feet climbed onto me and lay down on my stomach, followed by a second, a third. They enveloped me from all sides. I couldn't believe it. I thought I was dreaming. From head to toe, I found myself in a living coat of wolves. Their warmth eventually caused unbearable pain throughout my body. But I was happy. I felt alive. They warmed me. They saved me. Why? I asked myself. I could hear them as if communicating. They muttered something to each other. They are intelligent, I thought. And they are saving the killer of their kin. With that thought, I fell asleep. I woke up in the morning to the shouts of men from the village who came looking for me. The snow all around me was covered in wolf tracks. I got up and stumbled towards them somehow. The sky clear and the sun bright. I'm alive. It's a miracle. That's when I lost 2 fingers to frostbite. I think that's the only thing my saviors didn't cover. As you can see, they'll never shoot a gun again and never kill anyone. There was a time, about 5 years ago, when my mom complained about doorbell rings in the mornings. They came at night, between 2 and 3 o'clock, persistent and demanding. Mom would always wonder why no one else in the house heard them besides her. She would get up, walk to the hallway, and ask, not hurrying to open, "Who's there?" Yet every time, silence was the only response. We didn't have a peephole back then. It was installed during renovations 2 years ago. So, she listened carefully, thinking she might hear footsteps or rustling behind the door. But in vain the ringing continued, unanswered. Each time, Mom hesitated to open the door and returned to bed. In the morning, before leaving for work, she'd complain to my father and me that someone had rung the doorbell persistently at night, yet didn't respond. My dad, naturally skeptical and humorous, joked that it was Mom's conscience or a salary raised ghost paying her a visit. Mom herself didn't dare joke about it. Like my dad, I never heard these strange rings and thought Mom imagined them in her sleep. But it repeated every week with enviable regularity. Eventually, Mom just stopped going to check, and the nightly ringing ceased, temporarily as it turned out. Since last year, I've been suffering from insomnia. I could lie in the dark for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the clock near my ear. Time in those nights stretched slowly, like molasses. Only when dawn approached, bringing the much-awaited sleep, would I finally doze off, usually shallow and colorless. I hadn't tried sleeping pills, and herbal tea, chamomile, mint, or lime brewed for me at night didn't help much. Thus the night, the time for rest and sleep, turned into a period of agonizing wakefulness for me. It happened on one of those sleepless nights. It was early February. The night was pitch black and moonless. Snow was falling outside, and I was alone in the apartment. My parents had gone to visit my godmother but couldn't return due to canceled buses. I went to bed late, around 1 o'clock. I usually sleep earlier because classes start in the morning shift. But as soon as my head touched the pillow, I realized sleep was elusive again. I tossed and turned, wrapped myself in blankets and throws, buried my head in the pillow, trying hard to fall asleep. But all my attempts were in vain. I had to resort to an old tradition of lying on my back, motionless, thinking about everything under the sun and waiting for the sky to start getting light, because with the first rays of dawn, sleep would come. Then suddenly I shuddered with surprise. The doorbell rang. Piercingly, someone pressed the doorbell button too hard, as if intending to wake the neighbors as well. I thought my parents had returned and hurried to the front door, reaching for the doorknob, mechanically asking, "Who's there?" No one answered. I became alert. The bell rang again, just as persistently. "Who's there?" I asked again. "Answer me." Silence followed. I listened. No sounds behind the door, just complete silence. And then I felt a chill down my spine, and the bell rang again. I tiptoed and looked through the peephole. The landing was brightly lit by 2 light bulbs. I saw a boy standing at the threshold, about 10 years old, in a simple coat, without a hat, wearing felt boots, mittens hanging from elastic bands on his sleeves. His hair was dark, his face round but expressionless, with large, colorless eyes. Outside there was snow, but there were no snowflakes on him, and his clothes were dry. He raised his head and looked up, as if knowing I was watching him. And then I realized, how did such a little kid reach the doorbell? And why wasn't he responding? And where did he come from? We don't have any children of that age in the building. And these thoughts chilled me to the bone. I kept watching, and suddenly the boy twisted his lips, and his face darkened in an instant. He opened his mouth and said, "Don't look at me," his voice hoarse, creaky, like an old man's. "Don't look, or it'll be worse." I screamed in horror, stumbled back into the corridor. And there they were, scratching at the door and hoarsely muttering, "She saw, she saw, she saw, she saw." And I, paralyzed with fear, stood there not knowing what to do. And they kept scratching and muttering. "Oh God," I cried out, "protect me from the unclean," and began crossing the door with trembling hands. "Help me, Lord, save me from evil." And almost immediately, the scratching stopped. Something croaked, thudded against the door, and fell silent. and I kept making the sign of the cross with my hand. I stood there like that for another 10 minutes. I listened silence. I didn't dare look through the peephole. I went back to the room, turned on the light, and sat there until morning, until I passed out from tension and exhaustion. My parents returned around noon. They woke me up, complained about the bad weather, and asked what happened to the entrance door. They said there were scratches on it. It's covered in leather. We had it reupholstered not long ago, and the scratches were small but noticeable and deep. I thought I would faint when I saw them myself, but I didn't. I held it together. Since then, we haven't heard any knocks on the door. Neither has my mom. And thank God. Someone or something clearly resigned itself to the fact that they wouldn't be let in, or perhaps got scared that they were seen. Or they're knocking on another door, and God forbid, someone opens it for them.